What if the Soviet Union never collapsed? December 25th, 1991, Moscow. The sun sets early this time of year, casting long shadows across Red Square. Mikhail Gorbachev sits in his Kremlin office, preparing to make a final televised address. In a few hours, the Soviet flag, the hammer and sickle, will be lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet Union, a superpower that shaped the 20th century, that terrified and inspired billions, that reached for the stars and built nuclear weapons capable of ending civilization, will cease to exist. In our timeline, this is what happened. The Union dissolved peacefully. 15 republics became independent nations. The Cold War ended. America stood alone as the sole superpower. History, according to some, had reached its conclusion. Democracy and capitalism had won. But it didn't have to happen this way. The collapse wasn't inevitable. It was the result of specific choices, specific failures, specific moments when things went wrong instead of right. The Soviet economy was struggling, yes, but economies can be reformed. The political system was rigid, but systems can adapt. The republics wanted independence, but they could have been given autonomy within a federation. What if, in that critical period between 1985 and 1991, different choices had been made? What if the reforms had worked? What if the hardliners had been smarter? What if the Soviet Union had found a way to survive? This isn't a story about communism triumphant. The Soviet Union could never have won the Cold War in the traditional sense, but it could have survived it. It could have adapted, modernized, and continued as a major power into the 21st century. And if it had, the world you live in today would be profoundly different. There would be no single superpower, no unipolar moment, no end of history, just the continuation of a rivalry that shaped everything from technology to culture to the basic question of how humans should organize their societies. Let's start with what went wrong in our timeline and how it could have been prevented. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union is in crisis. The economy is stagnant. Industrial production is inefficient. Consumer goods are scarce. The war in Afghanistan is bleeding resources and morale. The Chernobyl disaster exposes systemic incompetence. And the people, especially the educated urban populations, are losing faith in the system. Mikhail Gorbachev becomes General Secretary in March 1985. He's younger than his predecessors, more energetic, more willing to admit that things need to change. He introduces two policies that will define his tenure: glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Glasnost allows more freedom of speech and press. The idea is that if problems can be discussed openly, they can be solved. Perestroika aims to reform the economy, introducing elements of market economics, while maintaining socialist principles. In our timeline, these policies fail. Glasnost unleashes criticism of the system that Gorbachev can't control. People don't just criticize inefficiency, they question the legitimacy of the Communist Party itself. Nationalist movements in the republics gain momentum. The Baltic states demand independence. Ukraine, Georgia, others follow. Perestroika fails to revive the economy. The half measures don't work. Cooperatives and limited private enterprise aren't enough. The state sector remains bloated and inefficient. By 1990, food shortages are severe. Lines for basic goods stretch for blocks. The public is angry. Gorbachev loses control. Conservative hardliners attempt a coup in August 1991 to preserve the Union. The coup fails. Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic, emerges as the real power. By December, Gorbachev is irrelevant. The Soviet Union dissolves. But what if the reforms had worked? What if Gorbachev, or someone like him, had been more cautious, more strategic? What if the Soviet leadership had looked at China? In our timeline, China provides an alternative model. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping begins economic reforms while maintaining Communist Party control. Special economic zones are created where capitalism is allowed. State-owned enterprises are reformed, not dismantled. Private business is encouraged, but the party maintains ultimate authority. Political dissent is suppressed, sometimes brutally, as in Tiananmen Square in 1989. The result is that China's economy grows rapidly while the Communist Party retains power. By the 21st century, China is an economic superpower, an authoritarian capitalist state that challenges Western models. The Soviet Union could have followed a similar path. In this alternate timeline, that's exactly what happens. But the path starts differently. Let's go back to 1985. In this timeline, Gorbachev is still General Secretary, but he's advised by a different circle. Economists who study the Chinese reforms, pragmatists who understand that political control must be maintained while the economy is liberalized. They convince Gorbachev that glasnost is dangerous. Openness can spiral into chaos. Instead, the focus must be entirely on economic reform. The policy is called rebuilding the foundation, rather than perestroika. It's a carefully controlled liberalization. Special economic zones are established in Western Soviet cities, Leningrad, Kiev, Minsk. Foreign investment is invited, but heavily regulated. Joint ventures with Western companies are encouraged in technology and manufacturing. The agricultural sector is reformed first. Collective farms are allowed to lease land to families on long-term contracts. Farmers can sell surplus production on the market. Food production increases almost immediately. The lines for bread shorten. Light industry is next. Cooperatives are allowed to produce consumer goods. Clothing, electronics, household items. The quality improves. People can finally buy things they want, not just what the state provides. Crucially, heavy industry and energy remain under state control. The commanding heights of the economy are not privatized. This prevents the oligarchic looting that occurred in Russia in the 1990s in our timeline. The reforms work. Slowly, cautiously, but they work. By 1988, Soviet GDP is growing. Inflation is controlled. Living standards are noticeably improving. But what about political reform? What about freedom? What about the republics demanding independence? In this timeline, the Soviet leadership learns from China's experience at Tiananmen Square. When demands for political freedom grow too loud, they must be suppressed decisively, not with the chaos and uncertainty that plagued Gorbachev, but with clear, overwhelming force. In 1989, as in our timeline, protests erupt in the Baltic states. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania demand independence. They remember their independence between the world wars. They resent being absorbed into the Soviet Union in 1940. In our timeline, Gorbachev is indecisive. He doesn't want to use force, but he also can't allow the Union to dissolve. The result is confusion and mixed signals. In this timeline, the response is swift and clear. Protests are allowed, but only in designated areas. When protesters in Tallinn and Vilnius march beyond those areas, security forces respond. Not with tanks, as in our timeline's attempted crackdown, but with riot police using non-lethal but effective crowd control. Water cannons, tear gas, mass arrests. Leaders of the independence movements are detained. Not killed, which would create martyrs, but imprisoned on charges of sedition. Trials are held. Sentences are harsh. The message is clear. Dissent within limits is tolerated. Challenges to the Union are not. Simultaneously, the Soviet government offers concessions. Greater autonomy for the republics, more control over local economies, cultural freedoms, including language rights. The Baltic republics can have their flags, their languages and schools, their cultural institutions, but they remain in the Union. It's a strategy of co-option and coercion, and it works mostly. The independence movements don't disappear, but they're weakened. The costs of resistance are too high. The benefits of staying in the Union, especially as the economy improves, are tangible. In Ukraine, which in our timeline becomes independent in 1991, the situation is more complex. Ukraine is deeply divided. Western Ukraine wants independence. Eastern Ukraine is more pro-Russian. In this timeline, the Soviet government exploits this division. It offers Ukraine substantial autonomy, essentially becoming a federated republic with its own parliament and control over local affairs. But it remains in the Union, its military integrated with Soviet forces, its foreign policy controlled from Moscow. By 1990, the Soviet Union has stabilized. The economy is growing. Political dissent is controlled. The republics are restless but contained. And crucially, the Communist Party has maintained its monopoly on power. Gorbachev, or perhaps a successor if he's been replaced, addresses the nation on television. We have preserved the Union. We have begun modernization. Our people's lives are improving. We will continue on this path carefully, without the chaos and destruction that some advocated. The Cold War doesn't end, it continues, but in a different form. In our timeline, the period from 1991 to 2001 is sometimes called the unipolar moment. The United States is the sole superpower. NATO expands eastward, absorbing former Warsaw Pact members. American culture, American technology, American political ideals spread globally. It's the era of globalization, of the Washington Consensus, of the belief that liberal democracy and capitalism are the inevitable future. But in the timeline where the Soviet Union survives, none of this happens. The Cold War continues, though it evolves. It's no longer primarily about nuclear arsenals and the threat of global annihilation. Those arsenals still exist, but both sides understand they can't be used. The competition shifts to other domains. Eastern Europe remains in the Soviet sphere. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, they're not occupied in the same way they were during the Cold War of our timeline. There are no Soviet tanks in the streets, but they're also not independent. They're part of an economic bloc, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, which is reformed to be less exploitative and more mutually beneficial. These countries are allowed to pursue their own economic policies within limits. They can trade with the West, but not to the point where they become economically dependent on it. They maintain their own militaries, but they're coordinated with Soviet strategic planning. It's a softer form of dominance, more like the relationship between the United States and its NATO allies. East Germany is a special case. In our timeline, German reunification is one of the most significant events of the post-Cold War era. In this timeline, it doesn't happen. The Berlin Wall, which fell in November 1989 in our timeline, remains standing. Or rather, it's transformed. It becomes less of a wall and more of a heavily monitored border. People can cross with the right documentation for work or visits, but the two Germanys remain separate states. West Germany, prosperous and democratic, is a showcase for capitalism. East Germany, reformed and modernizing, but still socialist, is a showcase for the Soviet model. The competition between them continues. It's not the desperate, impoverished East Germany of the 1980s. It's a serious rival, demonstrating that an alternative to Western capitalism can work. NATO doesn't expand. It remains focused on Western Europe. The border between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, though less militarized than during the height of the Cold War, is still a fundamental division of Europe. In the developing world, the competition continues. In our timeline, with the Soviet Union gone, the United States is the dominant external power in regions like the Middle East, Latin America, and Africa. But in this timeline, the Soviet Union remains active. It supports governments and movements that align with its interests, not with the same ideological fervor as during the Cold War, but pragmatically. Syria remains a close Soviet ally. Iraq, which in our timeline is invaded by the United States in 2003, has a more complex relationship with both superpowers. The Gulf War of 1991 still happens, with Iraq invading Kuwait, but the international response is complicated by Soviet opposition. A compromise is reached. Iraq withdraws from Kuwait, but Saddam Hussein remains in power with Soviet backing. Afghanistan is different. In our timeline, the Soviet Union withdraws in 1989, the communist government collapses, and the country descends into civil war, eventually leading to Taliban rule and becoming a base for al-Qaeda. In this timeline, the Soviet Union withdraws but continues to support the Afghan government with aid and air power. The government survives. Afghanistan remains in the Soviet sphere, a buffer state on the southern border. This means that 9/11, the September 11th attacks in our timeline, might not happen. Without Taliban-controlled Afghanistan providing a sanctuary, al-Qaeda's ability to plan and execute such an attack is limited. This doesn't mean terrorism disappears, but the specific trajectory of our timeline's war on terror doesn't occur. Instead, the conflicts of the late 20th and early 21st century remain proxy struggles between the superpowers, as they were during the Cold War. Every regional conflict has a superpower dimension. The United States supports one side, the Soviet Union supports the other. Neither side commits to full-scale intervention because the risk of direct confrontation is too great. By the year 2000, the world has two distinct blocks, two rival systems, two competing visions of the future, and the competition extends to technology. In our timeline, the Internet was developed primarily in the United States. ARPANET, the precursor to the Internet, was a Department of Defense project. When the Internet became commercial in the 1990s, American companies dominated. Google, Amazon, Facebook. These became global platforms. The Internet, though used worldwide, has a distinctly American character. But in the timeline where the Soviet Union survives, the Internet develops differently. Both superpowers recognize the strategic importance of networked communication and information. Both invest heavily in developing their own systems. In the Soviet Union, development of a national computer network begins in the late 1980s, parallel to economic reforms. It's called OGAS, the All-State Automated System. In our timeline, OGAS was proposed in the 1960s, but never fully implemented due to bureaucratic resistance and lack of resources. In this timeline, with economic reforms generating growth, the resources are available, and the political will exists because the leadership understands that information technology is the future. By the mid-1990s, the Soviet Union has its own Internet-like network. It's not as open as the Western Internet, access is controlled, content is monitored, but it's functional and growing. Soviet citizens can use it for email, information access, and even early e-commerce within the Soviet bloc. The two networks, Western and Soviet, are not completely separate. There are connection points for academic and commercial purposes, but they're heavily firewalled. Content doesn't flow freely between them. Each side fears that unrestricted information flow would allow the other to spread propaganda or conduct cyber espionage. By the 2000s, the global Internet is fragmented. There's the Western Internet, dominated by American companies, relatively open, driven by commercial interests and user content. And there's the Soviet Internet, more centralized, more controlled, but also more stable and secure from certain threats. This fragmentation has profound effects on culture and information. In our timeline, the Internet is a globalizing force. People around the world consume American media, use American platforms, engage with American cultural products. But in this timeline, half the world's Internet users are on a Soviet-influenced system. They consume different content, follow different influencers, engage with different narratives. And this shapes politics, culture, and society in fundamental ways. The information bubbles aren't just algorithmic, as in our timeline. They're geopolitical. People in the Soviet sphere and people in the Western sphere live in different information ecosystems. They don't just have different opinions. They have different facts, different narratives, different realities. In our timeline, the space race effectively ended when the United States landed on the Moon in 1969. The Soviet Union continued its space program, building space stations and sending probes to other planets, but it was clear that America had won the prestige competition. After the Cold War ended, space exploration became more collaborative. The International Space Station is a joint project involving the United States, Russia, Europe, Japan, and Canada. But in the timeline where the Soviet Union survives, the space race never ends. It evolves, but it continues. In the 1990s, with the Soviet economy stabilized and growing, funding for the space program increases. The Buran space shuttle program, which flew only once in our timeline before being canceled, is continued and refined. By the late 90s, the Soviet Union has a functioning reusable spacecraft, competing with the American space shuttle. The focus shifts to establishing a permanent human presence in space. Both superpowers build space stations. The Soviet Union's Mir station, which in our timeline operated until 2001, is continuously upgraded and expanded, becomes a permanent laboratory with a rotating crew of cosmonauts conducting research. The United States builds its own station, Freedom, which in our timeline was redesigned and became part of the International Space Station. In this timeline, it remains an American-only project, a competitor to Mir. The Moon becomes the next target, and in our timeline, no human has set foot on the Moon since 1972. But in this timeline, both superpowers plan return missions. The goal is not just to visit, but to establish permanent bases. The Moon has resources, including helium-3, which could be valuable for future fusion reactors. control of lunar resources becomes a strategic objective. By 2010, both the United States and the Soviet Union have small lunar bases. They're primarily scientific outposts, but they have military implications. The ability to operate on the moon demonstrates technological superiority and could be leveraged for strategic advantage. Mars is the ultimate prize. Both superpowers declare that they will send humans to Mars by 2030. The race is on. Massive funding is directed toward developing the necessary technologies. Life support systems, radiation shielding, propulsion systems that can make the journey in months rather than years. But there's a darker side. Space is also militarized. Anti-satellite weapons are developed and tested. Both sides maintain the ability to destroy the other satellites, which would cripple communication and navigation systems. Orbital weapons platforms are discussed, though not deployed, at least not openly. The weaponization of space is a constant concern, regulated by treaties that both sides occasionally accuse the other of violating. By the 2020s, space is not a realm of peaceful cooperation, but another arena of competition, and the same is true of other advanced technologies. In our timeline, artificial intelligence development accelerated in the 2010s. Companies like Google, OpenAI, and various Chinese firms competed to develop more advanced systems. By the 2020s, large language models, autonomous vehicles, and AI-driven decision systems are becoming common. But in the timeline where the Soviet Union survives, AI development is shaped by the superpower rivalry. Both sides invest heavily in AI, but for different reasons and with different approaches. In the West, AI development is driven primarily by commercial interests. Companies develop AI to improve products, optimize services, target advertising. There's military and intelligence applications, of course, but the cutting edge is often in the private sector. In the Soviet Union, AI development is state-directed. The government identifies AI as a strategic priority and funds research through state institutions and state-owned enterprises. The focus is on applications that enhance state control and military capability, surveillance systems that can monitor communications and identify dissidents, decision support systems for economic planning, autonomous weapons systems. By the 2010s, the Soviet Union has deployed pervasive surveillance powered by AI. Cameras are everywhere in Soviet cities, equipped with facial recognition. Internet activity is monitored by AI systems that can identify subversive content and flag users for investigation. It's an authoritarian dream or nightmare, depending on your perspective. The technology allows the state to maintain control with fewer human enforcers. The AI arms race extends to the military. Autonomous drones capable of identifying and engaging targets without human intervention are developed. Both superpowers deploy them, though both publicly claim that humans remain in the decision loop. Cyber warfare capabilities, enhanced by AI, allow for sophisticated attacks on infrastructure. Power grids, financial systems, communication networks, all are vulnerable. The fear of an AI-initiated conflict grows. What if AI systems, monitoring each other, interpreting each other's actions, escalate to war before humans can intervene? Arms control negotiations in the 2020s focus on AI, trying to establish rules and constraints. Progress is slow. Each side fears the other is cheating. The treaties that are signed are filled with loopholes. By the late 2020s, the world is more technologically advanced in some ways than in our timeline, driven by competition. But it's also more dangerous. The tools of control and destruction are more sophisticated, and the systems are more complex, more prone to catastrophic failure if something goes wrong. And yet, despite the tension, despite the rivalry, life for ordinary people in both blocs is improving. By the 2020s, the Soviet Union is unrecognizable from the sclerotic, failing state of the 1980s. Economic reforms have transformed it. GDP per capita, though still lower than in Western Europe or the United States, is respectable. Living standards are solidly middle income. Poverty, which plagued the Soviet Union in its final years in our timeline, has been largely eliminated. Soviet cities are modern. Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, they have gleaming skyscrapers, efficient public transportation, and vibrant commercial districts. Western brands are present, operating through joint ventures with Soviet entities. You can buy a McDonald's burger in Moscow, though it's called by a different name and the menu is adapted to local tastes. You can buy an iPhone, or rather a Soviet-made smartphone, that's functionally equivalent, designed with technology acquired through a mix of legitimate licensing and industrial espionage. The Soviet internet is bustling. Millions of users engage on social media, watch streaming videos, shop online. The content is different from the Western internet. There's more state propaganda, more restrictions on political speech. But there's also entertainment, art, culture. Soviet YouTubers, or their equivalent, create content about fashion, cooking, technology, travel. Soviet Netflix offers a library of films and series, a mix of Soviet productions and licensed Western content that's been approved by censors. Education is good. The Soviet Union always prided itself on its education system. And in this timeline, it's been modernized. Universities are well-funded. Research institutions produce cutting-edge work, though certain fields, like political science and history, are constrained by ideological restrictions. STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, mathematics are encouraged. The Soviet Union needs engineers and programmers, and it produces them in large numbers. Healthcare is universal and improving. The Soviet healthcare system was always free, but quality was inconsistent. In this timeline, with economic growth funding improvements, the system is better. Hospitals are modern. Medicines are available. Life expectancy has increased to levels comparable to Western Europe. But political freedom is limited. The Communist Party maintains its monopoly on power. Elections are held, but they're not competitive in any meaningful way. Candidates are vetted. Opposition parties are not allowed. Criticism of the system is tolerated within bounds, but crossing those bounds leads to consequences. Activists who push too hard are arrested. Independent journalists face harassment or worse. The surveillance state is pervasive. Everyone knows they're being watched. Conversations can be monitored. Internet activity is tracked. This creates a culture of self-censorship. People know what they can say and what they can't. Most accept it as the price of stability and prosperity, but some resist, operating in underground networks, using encryption and dark web technologies to evade surveillance. Dissidents exist, but they're few and isolated. The state is too powerful, too efficient at identifying and neutralizing threats. And honestly, for many people, life is good enough. They have jobs, apartments, consumer goods. They can travel within the Soviet bloc, and even to some Western countries, if they get permission. Why risk everything for abstract political freedoms? Culturally, the Soviet Union is influential. Soviet music, especially electronic and pop, influenced by Western styles, but with distinct Soviet characteristics, is popular across the Eastern Bloc and even has fans in the West. Soviet cinema produces films that compete at international festivals. Soviet fashion designers showcase at runway shows in Moscow and Paris. The Soviet Union in the 2020s is a hybrid. Economically, it's a mixed system, capitalist in practice but socialist in rhetoric. Politically, it's authoritarian, but less brutal than in the past. Culturally, it's dynamic, though constrained. It's a superpower, respected and feared, a model that some countries admire and others revile. But what about the United States? How has it evolved in a world where it's not the sole superpower? In our timeline, the period after the Cold War is one of American dominance. The United States is the world's largest economy, its most powerful military, its most influential culture. It intervenes in conflicts from the Balkans to the Middle East. It sets the rules for global trade and finance. It's not universally loved, but it's unquestionably the most powerful nation. In the timeline where the Soviet Union survives, America is still powerful, but it's not dominant. It's one of two superpowers, locked in an ongoing competition. Domestically, American politics are shaped by the ongoing Cold War. The sense of external threat creates some national unity, but also fuels paranoia. McCarthyism, the anti-communist hysteria of the 1950s, has echoes in this timeline. Though it's less crude, there's constant vigilance for Soviet influence. Accusations of being soft on communism are still politically potent. But there are also areas where the competition drives progress. Education is a national priority. The United States invests heavily in schools and universities to ensure it produces enough scientists and engineers to compete. Healthcare becomes a political issue earlier. If the Soviet Union can provide universal healthcare, why can't America? By the 2020s, the United States has adopted some form of universal healthcare, not out of pure altruism, but to demonstrate that capitalism can provide for people's needs. In many ways, the ongoing competition makes both superpowers better. They're forced to address problems because they can't afford to fall behind, but it also creates perpetual tension, perpetual fear. There's no peace dividend, no moment when resources can be redirected from military to purely civilian purposes. The world is always on edge. By the 2020s, the American public is tired. Decades of Cold War, generations who have lived their entire lives under the shadow of potential conflict are asking why. Why can't we just coexist? Why does everything have to be a competition? But the political and military establishments in both countries have reasons to maintain the rivalry. Industries depend on defense contracts. Politicians build careers on being tough on the other side. Intelligence agencies justify their budgets by finding threats. And there are real differences, real conflicts of interest that prevent détente. The world in the 2020s is prosperous by historical standards but exhausted, and it's heading toward a crisis. By the early 2030s, several long-simmering issues are coming to a head. Climate change, which in our timeline is a major challenge, is even worse in the timeline where the Cold War continues. Both superpowers invested in fossil fuel-based industries during their competitive economic development. Coal, oil, natural gas, these powered the economic growth that kept both systems viable. And while both sides developed renewable energy technologies, the transition has been slower because energy security, meaning control over one's own energy sources, was a strategic priority. The superpowers can't cooperate effectively to address the problem. Climate negotiations are hamstrung by mutual distrust. Each side accuses the other of not doing enough, of trying to gain advantage by forcing the other to bear more of the cost of mitigation. Treaties are signed but not fully implemented. The emissions continue. And there's another problem. The authoritarian technologies that the Soviet Union pioneered have spread. Many governments, not just the Soviet Union and its allies, have deployed pervasive surveillance, AI-driven social control, and manipulation of information. In the West, democratic norms are eroding under the pressure of security concerns and technological capabilities. The line between free societies and controlled ones is blurring. Public protests grow. In the West, movements demand action on climate change, restrictions on surveillance, reduction in military spending. In the Soviet Union and its sphere, protests are fewer and more quickly suppressed. But underground discontent simmers. Young people who have known nothing but the managed prosperity of the reformed Soviet system start asking why they can't have the freedoms they see on the Western Internet. Both systems are under strain, and in this climate, an incident occurs that brings the world to the brink. May 15, 2034, the Baltic Sea. A Soviet submarine is conducting exercises near the maritime border between the Soviet-controlled Baltic states and NATO member Poland. An American destroyer is monitoring the exercises. Tensions have been high recently. There was a cyber attack on American infrastructure, traced to sources in the Soviet Union. The United States retaliated with its own cyber attack. Both sides denied responsibility, but militaries on both sides are on heightened alert. The submarine is operating close to the boundary. Too close, the American destroyer captain believes. He orders his ship to maneuver into a position to track the submarine more closely. The Soviet submarine captain interprets this as aggressive. He orders evasive maneuvers. In the confusion, the submarine rises unexpectedly. The American destroyer, not expecting the submarine to surface so close, has to veer sharply to avoid collision. But it's too late. The destroyer's bow clips the submarine. Both vessels are damaged. Sailors on both sides are injured. Some die. Within hours, the incident is international news. Both sides blame the other. Soviet media show footage of the damaged submarine, paint the Americans as reckless aggressors. American media show their sailors being pulled from the water, frame it as Soviet provocation. Governments on both sides are under pressure to respond. Hardliners demand retaliation. In Moscow, military leaders present options to the Soviet leadership: sanctions, cyber attacks, even limited military strikes against American assets. In Washington, the president faces similar pressure. And then, someone makes a mistake, or perhaps it's deliberate, an act by a faction that wants war. The details are never fully clear. But on May 23rd, 8 days after the initial incident, an American base in Poland is hit by a missile. The missile is traced to the Kaliningrad exclave, Soviet territory surrounded by NATO members. The American president demands an explanation. The Soviet leadership claims it was an accident, a malfunction, during an exercise. But the Americans don't believe it. Pressure mounts for retaliation. And in the Pentagon, in the Kremlin, generals are pulling out plans. Plans for limited military strikes, plans for larger operations, plans that haven't been seriously considered in decades but have always been kept updated, just in case. The world watches. Stock markets crash. People rush to buy supplies, fearing the worst. Embassies evacuate non-essential personnel. The alert levels of nuclear forces are raised. For 72 hours, humanity holds its breath. Both sides position forces. Satellite surveillance shows troop movements. Submarines put to sea. Bombers are loaded and placed on standby. And then, on May 26th, a message is sent. Through back channels, through intermediaries, the Soviet leadership reaches out. They propose an emergency summit. A meeting between the American president and the Soviet General Secretary. Neutral ground, Switzerland, immediate. The American president agrees. Plans are made. Both leaders fly to Geneva. The meeting is held behind closed doors. No aides except translators. Just the two most powerful people in the world trying to pull back from the edge. What do they say to each other? The details are never released, but after 8 hours they emerge. A joint statement is read. Both sides agree to de-escalate. The incident in the Baltic was a tragedy, a result of miscommunication and proximity. The missile strike on Poland was, as the Soviets claimed, a malfunction. Compensation will be paid. Procedures will be put in place to prevent future incidents. A hotline, direct communication between the two leaders, will be established and tested regularly. The crisis passes, but it leaves a mark. The world came closer to war than it had in decades, and everyone realizes that the system, the balance that has kept the peace since the Cold War began, is fragile. It relies on rational actors, making careful decisions under pressure, and there are so many ways it could fail. In the aftermath, there are calls for a fundamental rethinking. Activists, intellectuals, even some politicians argue that the world can't continue like this, that the rivalry has to end, or at least transform into something less dangerous, that the challenges facing humanity, climate change, pandemics, technological disruption, require cooperation, not competition. But others argue the opposite. The hardliners in both camps see the crisis as proof that the other side can't be trusted, that strength, vigilance, and readiness are more necessary than ever, that any move toward détente is weakness that will be exploited. By 2035, a year after the Baltic incident, the world is at a crossroads. Two futures are possible. One where the superpowers find a way to coexist peacefully to address common challenges together. Another where the competition intensifies, the systems become more rigid, the risk of catastrophe grows. The Soviet Union that exists in 2035, over 40 years after it was supposed to collapse, is a strange hybrid. It's wealthy enough to provide for its citizens, technologically advanced enough to compete with the West, politically stable through a combination of prosperity, repression, and nationalism. But it's also inflexible, unable to reform further without risking the control that keeps it intact. The West, particularly the United States, has been shaped by decades of competition. It's more militarized than in our timeline, more unified in some ways, with less room for dissent that might seem to aid the enemy, but also more tired, more questioning of the costs of endless rivalry. The younger generation, in both East and West, is different from their parents. They've grown up with the internet, even if it's fragmented. They've seen each other's cultures, even if through a glass darkly. They communicate sometimes across the divide, and they wonder why the world has to be this way. The superpowers face a choice. They can maintain the system that has kept them in power for decades. The surveillance, the military spending, the competition, it's worked in the sense that the system hasn't collapsed. But it's also unsustainable. Climate change, resource scarcity, technological disruption. These problems can't be solved by one superpower alone. They require global cooperation. Or the superpowers can attempt a genuine détente, not just arms control and communication, but a fundamental transformation of the relationship. Opening borders, integrating economies, allowing people and ideas to flow freely. It's risky. It could destabilize both systems. The Soviet Union especially fears that true openness would unleash demands for political freedom that would bring down the whole structure. By 2040, no clear decision has been made. The world muddles along, managing crises, avoiding catastrophe, but not solving fundamental problems. Both superpowers are locked in a system that neither fully controls, a system that persists because changing it is too dangerous and too difficult. In Moscow, in the halls of the Kremlin, the General Secretary looks at reports. The economy is stable, but growth is slowing. The surveillance systems report rising discontent, especially among the young. The military warns that the Americans are developing new technologies that could shift the balance. The scientists plead for more funding to keep up. In Washington, the president faces similar reports. The economy is strong but unequal. The endless military spending crowds out investment in infrastructure and social programs. The public is weary of the competition but afraid of what might happen if America shows weakness. The intelligence agencies report that the Soviets are close to breakthroughs in AI and quantum computing that could give them an advantage. Both leaders face the same question. How long can this continue, and what happens when it can't? In our timeline, the Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. America had its moment as the sole superpower. Brief as it turned out to be, history didn't end, but it did change direction dramatically. In the timeline where the Soviet Union never collapsed, there's no such moment, no clear break. Just the continuation of a rivalry that has defined the world for over 90 years. Two systems, two visions, locked in a competition that neither can win and neither can afford to lose. The world of 2040 in this timeline is more advanced in some ways than ours. Technology has been pushed forward by competition, but it's also more dangerous, more divided, more exhausted, and it's heading toward a reckoning. Because something has to give, the climate is changing, resources are depleting, technologies are becoming powerful enough to either solve humanity's problems or create new catastrophic ones, and the system that's kept the peace, fragile as it is straining. In Geneva, plans are being made for another summit. The American president and the Soviet general secretary are scheduled to meet in 3 months. The agenda is ambitious. Climate cooperation, arms control, opening communication, maybe even beginning the process of ending the Cold War. But there are forces on both sides that don't want that to happen. Military-industrial complexes that depend on the competition. Ideologues who believe compromise is betrayal. Factions that benefit from the current system and fear what change might bring. As the summit approaches, tensions rise. There are incidents. A spy is arrested in Moscow. An embassy official is expelled from Washington. Cyber attacks increase. Each side accuses the other of trying to sabotage the summit before it begins. And in the shadows, in the intelligence agencies and the military commands, contingency plans are being updated. Plans for what to do if the summit fails. Plans for how to prevail if the competition turns kinetic. Plans that everyone hopes will never be used, but that everyone knows might be necessary. The summit is scheduled for August 15th, 2040. The world watches and waits, hoping for breakthrough, fearing collapse, wondering if this is the moment when the Cold War finally ends. Or the moment when it finally goes hot. 3 months, 90 days, and the future of humanity hangs in the balance. The Soviet Union never collapsed, but the question now is whether the world it created can survive.